So I will go next. I'll talk a little bit about the election results and the election campaign, and ask whether the center has held and can hold in Germany. Here we go. So I assume you've seen the results, but here you see them again. The ambassador has already given us the big picture. We see losses of all the three parties that previously formed the government, in part relatively large losses, a relatively moderate, I should say, win for the CDU-CSU, the Christian Democrats, and the AfD, the far right, doubling their vote in this election. And the second winner is the Left Party, which had late in the election campaign a very interesting surge of support. What, in my analysis, were the main factors explaining these results? Certainly the failure of the previous government to work constructively together. I must admit that I personally had significant hopes in this government. I look back at my presentation from 3.5 years ago, when it really seemed that this government could get us out of this grand coalition pattern where always the big parties work together, and that encourages the far right to be the main opposition. This did not work because the three parties that formed the government, despite having some notable legislative successes on clean energy, they just did not manage to work together, and the perception was that this government was just dysfunctional, and it collapsed, as you know, in the fall. So that was the main factor explaining the losses of all the previous government parties. Economic challenges, the ambassador has mentioned that, perhaps not so much personal economic challenges, but the perception that the German economy was not performing, and then a focus in the campaign on migration, which everyone who studies the far right knows always helps the far right. So we had the centrist conservatives essentially taking over a lot of far right positions during the campaign and staging a vote in the Bundestag on tougher migration and border security rules, hoping perhaps that the perception in the population that there is too much migration and the borders are not secure enough would give them votes. But the polls did not see an increase for the Christian Democrats after they did that. If anything, they went down a little bit. What was not decisive is, or was in the election, any candidate really? Excitement for the winner? No, he is not a super exciting candidate, super charismatic or anything like that. If there was any one candidate who generated a little bit of excitement, it was one of the co-leaders of the Left Party, Heidi Reicheneck, who, due to her speech in the Bundestag, went viral on certain social media platforms. What was also relatively unimportant in the result was the overt and blatant attempts to interfere in the election by the United States government in person of Elon Musk and J.D. Vance, who both openly called on the AfD to be included in the next German government. Now we have a narrow centrist majority, which, as the ambassador mentioned, is now negotiating about forming the next government. But it's really a majority thanks to two things. First of all, the peculiarities of the German electoral system, which only sees parties that gain 5% or more being represented in parliament. You see, we had two parties which just barely did not make 5%, and that meant that about 45% of the votes for the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats will generate a Bundestag majority. The second effect that makes this majority possible is really voters 60 and older, who voted more than 60% for these two parties, whereas voters 25 and younger, only 25% of these younger voters voted for one of the parties that will form the government, and the left and the AfD were the most popular parties for these younger voters. If we look at the position of the parties approximately on a party spectrum that today is usually depicted as two-dimensional in Europe, with the left-right axis looking at economic positions from a strong state, redistribution, and so on, to free markets on the right, but then another dimension that pits what is called green alternative and libertarian positions against traditionalist, authoritarian, nationalist positions. We see that the parties that will likely form this next government are indeed centrist and actually fairly close to each other in their priorities. It looked until relatively late in the election evening as if it may be necessary to include the Greens in this government, and you see that it would make things significantly more complicated because they differ from these parties in a number of their policy positions. So despite them obviously being differences in policy positions between the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats, this is a government that has existed in the past and that should be able to come about, and there is a chance that it might work more effectively than the previous government. So that's the good news. The concerning news is that you can really ask the question whether the center did hold. And if it did, then just barely. You see here the regional breakdown of the vote in the last 3 federal elections from 2017 to now. Blue is the far right, the Alternative für Deutschland, AfD. And you see that by now they are the strongest party, not necessarily the majority, but the plurality in almost all of Eastern Germany. And they also made inroads, which is really for the very first time, and became the strongest party in some Western European ridings. You don't see Gelsenkirchen here, it's just below where it says North Rhine-Westphalia. If you look very closely, you might see a little bit of blue, and this is Kaiserslautern. This is where, for the first time in Western Germany, the AfD was the strongest party. So that really raises the question of whether the rise of this party can be arrested. It has now become a majority party in much of Germany. Obviously, Friedrich Merz has very clearly ruled out forming a government with them. That's what he calls the firewall against the far right. And I think he was super clear on that in comments after the election. But why some people ask how long this will hold is that there is a degree of overlap in policy positions between his Christian Democrats and the AfD on some issues. This here is taken from the newspaper Der Spiegel, based on an online app called Valomat, which presents 38 statements and then asks all parties to comment which view they have on these statements, and that way you can position yourself and you can ask all of these questions and it will tell you which party is closest to your preferences. Anyways, what they did here is looking at the overlap between these statements between parties and found out that according to this, there was actually more overlap between the Christian Democrats and the AfD than between the Christian Democrat and the SPD. Now, mind you, what this did not do is weigh the statements in importance, and that's a very important point to mention. So they might agree on, I don't know, a relatively unimportant issue that is not mainstream, but disagree on a very important thing such as should we abolish the euro. So that has to be taken into account, but we still need to see that from the perspective of many supporters of these parties, there is in many areas a particular or a significant overlap. So finally, what will be, in my perception, the main challenges for the next government that will decide whether it will be successful and also whether it can arrest and push back the rise of the far right? First of all, how to boost economic growth. A major challenge in this respect that contributed significantly to the collapse of the old government are the rules in the German constitution on the so-called debt brake, which prevent the government from having a deficit that is too large, which made it essentially impossible to boost economic growth or to invest in the military. There is now talk about potentially reforming the constitution, but that would require a constitutional amendment. But in my view, that's absolutely necessary to have a functioning government. Secondly, address the issue of migration. But by that, I think what needs to happen, and that is now my personal opinion, is to reframe the debate away from border control or deportations to a discussion of EU-wide solution, to a discussion of integration of immigrants, refugees especially. And also, if you look at many of the crimes that dominated much of the electoral debate, that person driving a car through the Christmas market in Magdeburg before the holidays and so on, there's obvious mental health challenges, which should not excuse what happened, but certainly would also be an issue that needs to be addressed in discussions of migration. So that, in my view, would be important. And then to Trump-proof Europe, Friedrich Merz is a very pro-American president. He was apparently the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library is his favorite place in the United States. I read somewhere he, if anyone, always felt close to the United States, but he was very clear in the debate of the leaders after the election that he sees the United States as withdrawing from Europe and no longer a reliable ally. And that requires working with European partners to strengthen European defense. That links back to the need to finance that. So that will be a major challenge for the new government as well. Thanks very much.